So hello everyone, and welcome to the Wharton Esherick Museum's final spotlight for the 2024 season. If you haven't seen my face on here before or you need a quick refresher, my name is Ethan Snyder and I'm the manager of collections and public programs at the Wharton Esherick Museum. Since today's spotlight is our final one for the 2024 season, I thought that this would be a really nice opportunity to put a bow on our guiding principle for this past year, which was rhythms. Throughout 2024, we've thought about and explored the concept of rhythms in quite an expansive way. For example, the rhythms represented in some of Esherick's carvings and prints were put on view this past spring in our visitor center. We hosted lectures on the rhythms of intentional communities in Esherick, or the intentional communities that the Esherick family was involved in. We hosted workshops on eurythmy, a form of modern dance that the Esherick family experimented with, and our current exhibition focuses on the rhythms of Esherick's work. And all of these have really formed a wonderful year of programming that has kind of explored this central theme of rhythms that's explicated a lot of things about Wharton Esherick's life. So in order to round out this expansive year of rhythms, we'll be focusing today on a large oil painting on canvas that is definitely out of rhythm with Esherick's other work, and which also hasn't seen the light of day in over 20 years. So let me give you all a brief roadmap of today's talk before we get fully underway. First, we'll talk a little bit about this painting, who it depicts, and the larger context surrounding it. Then I'll talk about how this piece came to the museum, the information that we know about it, and then we'll get into some of the outstanding questions and mysteries surrounding it before we talk about why it feels particularly out of step with some of the more traditional or familiar rhythms of Wharton Esherick's life and work. So this large oil portrait was completed in 1921, and it's titled Harlequin. It depicts Ruth Doing, who you can see in the middle of that photograph on the screen, who is one of the founders of the Doing-Gardner dance camp located in the Adirondacks, where the Esherick family summered in the 1920s and 1930s. Esherick's portrait of Ruth Doing shows her as a harlequin, hence the title, and harlequin is a historic costume from Italian stage dramas that I would say is loosely related to what we know today as jesters, clowns, and the practice of pantomime. The portrait stands at over 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide when framed, and is undoubtedly one of the largest, if not the largest, oil painting that Esherick ever completed, measuring at 76.5 by 47 inches when framed. So Ruth Doing was a former student of the pioneering modern dancer Isadora Duncan. And together with her partner, the opera singer Gail Gardner, the two women ran a dance camp in upstate New York that they had taken over from the dance educator Alice Bentley in the 19-teens. It was first called the Ruth Doing School of Rhythmics, and when the operation moved from Lake Chateauguay to Lake Regis in 1925, it was renamed the Gardner Doing Camp for Rhythmics. And based on some materials related to this operation that Esherick actually helped to illustrate, it appears that Ruth Doing also operated her own dance school in New York City, just below Central Park and on the same block as Carnegie Hall. So what a great location for a dance school. The family learned about this camp through their friends, famed American author Sherwood Anderson, and his wife, famed American sculptor Tennessee Anderson. The first of many visits was during the summer of 1920, and at this camp, Letty likely enjoyed the large community of women who attended that shared her interests in health, the outdoors, art, dance, and education. And here on the screen are just a couple scans from the Esherick family photo album showing some of the photos that were taken at the dance camp through the years. And here is Wharton Esherick up top. So Wharton, we know, tried his hand at rhythmic dancing at this camp, but he likely focused his attention on his visual art practice, making hundreds of sketches in pen and pencil, along with watercolors and oil paintings, and some of the sketches we see here on the screen. And being surrounded by dancers was undoubtedly great fodder for Wharton Esherick's visual art practice. Later, sculpture in plaster and wood, prints and furniture were also made at this camp. Here we see an image on the right side of the screen of Esherick working on the sculpture dance finale at the Doing-Gardner dance camp in 1933, that now lives in two parts at Wharton's home and studio. It's likely that some of the prints and furniture were done as payment for attendance at the camps, since prints were reproduced for promotional materials and trestle tables were designed and or made to be used at the campsite. For example, we see the print Gal's Cabin that was copied and its size reduced by a process known as photomechanical reproduction so that it could fit onto this brochure and other pamphlets about or to promote the Doing-Gardner dance camp. So the information that we do know about this painting comes from a few different sources that we have on site, such as a letter from Wharton Esherick to the Museum of Contemporary Crafts related to the artist's solo show in 1958, old quarterly newsletters from the museum, donation files, photographs from the family's time at the dance camp, and some correspondence between Esherick's daughter and museum founder Ruth Esherick and her friend Sylvia Miller, who was a student of Ruth Doing, and through the years made many donations to WEM of dance camp related materials. So otherwise, this painting is curiously absent from places where one would imagine that it would appear, such as in the ledger book that Letty Esherick kept to document her husband's work. And we'll get to that a little bit later. So we can tell from this painted inscription in Roman numerals on the left side of the screen that this canvas is titled Harlequin and is completed in 1921. It's indeed of Ruth Doing, as the letters RD here on the top of the inscription would suggest. The painting is arguably too large to safely remove from Esherick's bedroom, so unfortunately we were kind of limited in where and how we could photograph this piece, both for documentation purposes and today's talk. But I think this photo on the right side of the screen gives a good idea of what this painting looks like. And to get a better sense of the size of this portrait, we posed our colleague Casey Chu next to it for scale. And you can see that this painting is, about life size or a little bit larger than life. So Harlequin arrived at the Wharton Esherick Museum in late 1993, and it was first announced to the public in the Museum Quarterly from the spring of 1994. This donation to the Esherick Museum was so exciting to the leadership and staff that it actually spurred a new interest and a whole exhibition in the visitor center that was focused on Esherick's painting practice between 1913 and 1925. It's been suggested in the past that this painting actually may have been done in exchange for camp tuition in the article that was written to accompany this donation in 1994. And that's possible. However, knowing that Wharton made prints that were used and reused by the camp as well as furniture, I think it's possible that this could have also been a personal gift that was kind of outside of official camp administrative business. But we can't say that for sure because we do know that Esherick liked to create his own little barter economies with the communities that he was involved in. But nonetheless, this painting was gifted to the museum by Ruth Doing's niece, who inherited this after Doing passed away. And unfortunately, we don't know that much about the discussions or the processes that took place before this painting actually arrived at the museum's doorstep. But a letter between Ruth Esherick and her friend Sylvia Miller, a former student of Doing, actually gives us a little bit more information on this. So in a personal letter written to Ruth Esherick in 1994, Sylvia Miller notes that she had, quote, seen the Harlequin painting of Ruth Doing. It lived right here in this house where Ruth lived and then died, and I gave it to Mary as she was R.D.'s niece. So, from Sylvia Miller's phrasing here, I get the idea that the two must have stayed very close, and I wonder whether Sylvia Miller was actually writing from Ruth's home, as she used the phrase right here, or was involved in settling her estate. And this painting also appears very briefly in a really interesting place in the Wharton Esherick family papers. Um, and as we'll talk about in a little bit, the painting doesn't appear where you would expect it, but does appear where you wouldn't. So in the lead up to Wharton Esherick's groundbreaking solo show at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts in 1958, there was a lot of back and forth between Esherick and the curators about what pieces to show. Works weren't just selected from Wharton's home and studio, but also from the private homes of his clients. So, for example, the show included Nat and Rose Rubinson's music stand from their home in Marion, just outside of Philadelphia, a hanging shelf from Ellen and Olaf Rove's kitchen in Connecticut, and a group of phonograph and record cabinets from the Rabinowitz family in upstate New York. And we know from a letter that Esherick wrote that there were particular pieces, such as the 1958 cabinet desk, that he wanted to be represented in this solo show of his. And I'm quoting from the letter here that you see on the right side of the screen. I have some new things to show you in the shop. One particularly that I would like to have in the show, Esherick wrote in October 1958 to Robert Lauer, who is the museum's curator, likely in reference to that cabinet desk that was finished right around that time. This large canvas, while it didn't ultimately appear in the Museum of Contemporary Crafts solo show for Esherick, it appears to have been one of those pieces that he advocated for having in the show. So while there's only short reference in this letter, it does give us a glimpse into what this painting might have meant for Esherick. So at the very end of this same letter on the right side of the screen, Esherick writes to Robert Lauer, the curator, how his quote unquote invasion of Connecticut went. And Wharton says, at Ruth Doing's, there's a full length portrait of her in the character of Harlequin that I painted. If you're in the neighborhood, you can find their place. Contact Miss Louis R. Bybee, Briar Road, Stamford. So while this reference may only appear as an aside in the larger project of this exhibition, I think when we're examining this letter within the context of this painting, we can kind of get an idea about how Esherick felt about it. So there was only one painting and four prints that were listed out of the 90 objects put into Esherick's solo show in 1958 that was mainly focused on his sculpture and furniture. And the painting that was shown was another portrait, not of Ruth Doing, actually of Theodore Dreiser, that was lent by the University of Pennsylvania, who's the repository for the Dreiser papers. And this portrait I'm highlighting here, it's just a listing, unfortunately, but it only measures up to about 2 feet tall and doesn't appear anywhere in the correspondence between Esherick and the Museum of Contemporary Crafts. So, this begs the question of whether Esherick wanted something larger and more monumental to represent his earlier practice as a painter, like this portrait of Ruth Doing, or if he had a particular affinity for this portrait in general. Um, we can't be conclusive, but I think the fact that Esherick was advocating for this piece of his says a lot, says that he admired this piece and felt pretty strongly about it as a piece of his oeuvre. So I mentioned a bit earlier that this painting was exhibited at the Wharton Esherick Museum in 1994. Because it didn't make it into the 1958 solo show, I'm wondering whether or not this painting was ever exhibited beyond the 1990s at the Esherick Museum. Any evidence that it would have been exhibited earlier or during Esherick's lifetime is unfortunately scant. However, we do know that Esherick had his paintings exhibited long after he devoted himself to furniture and sculpture. So it's not out of the realm of possibility. And this possibility is supported by an old label that we see on the left side of the screen, affixed to the back of the top stretcher of the painting. And most of the label, unfortunately, has been lost to time. Enough of it remains that when we found this painting, we could confirm that it is indeed Harlequin and done by Wharton Esherick. But all of the information that would suggest if this was exhibited and where would be on the missing part of the label, unfortunately. But we do have extant labels in our collection. So many of Esherick's paintings actually retain their original labels from previous exhibitions. Here we're looking at the painting Woodcarver's Shop with a label that I'm led to believe is from the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. Um, and so I'm led to believe that the label on the back of Harlequin could be an exhibition label, just like we're looking at here. But without more information, again, we can't be too conclusive. So now that we've covered some of the context around this painting and the information that we can glean about it from our own documents and our special collections and archive, let's try to address the idea that I teased at the beginning of this talk. That this painting, not the ones that we're looking at the screen, but the one of Ruth Doing, feels particularly out of step with the rhythms of Esherick's practice as a painter. So we know that many of Esherick's paintings were actually done from life. And by that, I mean his practice of painting landscapes and plein air, or the indoor scenes of his early woodshop, were likely done while sitting right there. They were done at the same time that Esherick was sitting there doing these paintings. Um, and otherwise, we do know that Wharton sometimes painted subjects from feelings, memories, and preliminary sketches, but it seems like most of his painting practice was done from life in the outdoors or from his shop and things like that. So, what makes this portrait of Ruth Doing a little different is that it likely wasn't painted from life while Esherick was in the audience watching her perform as Harlequin, but rather it was painted from a silver gelatin photograph that we have in our collection that we're looking at here on the left side of the screen. The fact that this painting was likely done from this small photograph does make it quite unusual in the context then of Esherick's work as a painter. And we know that there are dozens and dozens of photographs bound together from the Esherick family's time at the Doing-Gardner dance camp. Some, like the ones we see here, show people dancing or in costumes, being outdoors. Others show people working in gardens, boating on the lake, doing leisurely reading on a porch or something like that. And some are taken indoors and show people on a wooden stage with a large curtain behind them, which I presume is the same stage that we are seeing Ruth Doing stand on, that was just photographed in a slightly larger format. So I'm led to believe that all of the stages that we're seeing here are the same, and that is the stage that's represented in Wharton's portrait. So painting from a photographic print was a markedly different tradition than working in plein air. And with the advent of photographic technology in the second half of the 19th century, portraiture derived from photography became an increasingly popular practice that made sitting for portraits much more accessible for people because it did away with the need to sit in front of an artist, sometimes for multiple sessions on end. So photography then became an aid for other artistic mediums as it became part of kind of the preparatory phases for painting, sketching, and printing. And what we're seeing here is an engraving based on a painting that was based on a photograph. Um, and I wanted to show this because it kind of illustrates the limitations of making portraits from photos. So, for example, when you're building a group portrait like we see here from individual pictures, things start to get a little wonky because people are facing in all these different directions just based on how they were photographed originally. So, whether Esherick knew it or not, he was kind of taking part in this other tradition of painting that involved technologies like photography. But otherwise, we know that Esherick often, and probably most often, sketched in preparation for his prints, sculpture, paintings, and even pieces of furniture as well. And we don't really know beyond this example of the Ruth Doing portrait that Esherick really ever used photography in the preparatory phases for his work. So, as an example of the sketching that he did in preparation for other final work, we see his preparatory sketch for the 1928 print of A Great City that was done for Theodore Dreiser. And, clearly these are very different from the preparatory phase to the finished product. But we can see that Esherick was kind of working out the design and the process that he was going to use to create this final print. So another reason why this canvas that we're talking about today feels particularly outside of the normal rhythms of Esherick's work is that Letty Esherick did not appear to have cataloged this painting for her husband as she would have normally done. So this documentation that Letty kept for her husband was undoubtedly part of the rhythms of Esherick's work. And for a painting that undoubtedly stands out from the rest of his oeuvre, it's quite curious to me that it actually doesn't appear in any of the record books that were kept. So it's true that Letty didn't document every single painting that her husband completed, such as, for example, the painting that's currently on display in the studio titled Forest Fantasy. However, considering this massive canvas was completed during the first full year of work that Letty documented for her husband, it is curious to me why it may not have been included. It's possible, of course, that if this painting were indeed a gift or a kind of barter for camp tuition, that there wouldn't have been a reason to catalog it since keeping track of it wouldn't be necessary. But if we do look further into the ledger book and really just the following year, we can see that Letty starts to document work that was gifted. Two paintings were actually gifted to Ruth Doing that were documented. So the exact reason for Harlequin's exclusion from this ledger book still remains a mystery for the time being. Um, but I do have a feeling that there's a chance that because it was a gift and there really was no reason to keep track of it in 1921, that Letty didn't feel the need to put it into this book. And even though this painting is left out of Esherick's ledger book, the information about paintings that it does record gives us some great context for why this painting is so peculiar. So one aspect of Esherick's paintings that Letty recorded was their size. And we can see the dimensions kind of in this middle column here running on both sides of the screen. And when we survey the various sizes of Esherick's oil paintings that Letty recorded in this ledger book, it becomes clear just how remarkable this painting is for its size alone. It's likely Wharton Esherick's largest painting. It is likely, I'm sorry, Wharton Esherick's largest painting by quite a wide margin. Harlequin is at least 2 feet taller than the other oil paintings that Letty documented. And one reason why I think it's so much larger or taller than these other paintings is because Wharton was primarily focused on landscape painting. And landscapes are going to be longer than they are tall. We call that landscape orientation. Um, and while it's true that Esherick did complete a number of portraits, which would be taller than they are wide to kind of fit the subject inside of the painting, they don't come close to Harlequin in size. So we can see here, and I've highlighted a number of sizes on the screen, that many of Esherick's paintings seemed to be around 16 inches tall by 20 inches wide, 16 inches tall by 24 inches wide, or 18 inches tall by 24 inches wide. I would have to do further research to say whether or not these are quote unquote standard sizes for canvases. But it seems like for Esherick's practice, these three sizes were indeed pretty standard. And the largest painting that Letty Esherick documented in this book was a Chester Valley landscape entitled The Winding Road, which appears to be 24 inches tall by 30 inches wide, or 24 inches tall by 34 inches wide. And that would be the widest painting that Letty documents here. And in comparison, Harlequin is still a foot wider. Um, and the painting is still a few feet taller than the tallest documented painting called White Oak that measures up to 25 inches tall. And at this size, it's unlikely that Esherick would have ever been making his own frames. And as we can see here in the right-hand part of the columns, that Letty was documenting the size of the frames too. And if Harlequin was indeed, at least a foot taller and wider than all of these other canvases, I think it would have been quite a challenge for Esherick to have made a frame at that scale at that time, and probably wouldn't necessarily have been worth his time. And when we look pretty closely at the canvas and the frame, I'm led to believe, just based on the color, that this is a commercial frame and not an Esherick made frame. So, in conclusion, there are a number of reasons why this painting feels particularly out of step with the traditional rhythms we know of Wharton Esherick's life and work, and those rhythms that we've explored throughout the 2024 season, including the painting size, the process by which it was painted, and its lack of documentation. And it is precisely because this painting is outside of those rhythms that it's of such interest to us, and that it's such a wonderful didactic tool for expanding and challenging our ideas about those traditional rhythms of Esherick's life and work. So without further ado, happy to take any questions, flip back to any slides as people would like, and I'll stop sharing my screen for the time being.
One thing looking at this painting, it reminds me of there's a painting that David saved when Wharton was destroying all his stuff of Caruso that was made when he was employed by Victor. And the bearing of the two characters is very, very similar. So I wonder if some of the difference between this painting and his others comes from that time of being a painter for hire
Mm.
that shows up in it.
Yeah, and I guess we know that he would have been depicting, theatrical subjects for work in those very, very early years.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Paul, let me ask you, were you employed at the museum when this was donated?
No, no, I wasn't,
Okay.
unfortunately. Um, there is one larger canvas um, that he painted as a backdrop for a theatrical production at the Chester Valley Grange um, that was rolled up and stored up above the visitor center. I'm not sure where it is now, but it's huge. Sort of a tropical scene.
Ooh, that's amazing. We'll have to look into that.
Yeah, yeah, it's clearly uh, a piece that was quickly done for this theater piece, not with the care that he usually took in his things. Yeah, worth checking out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. All right. Well, if we don't have any questions, you're always free to give us a call, shoot us an email if anything comes up.